All right, welcome back to afternoon session. We are starting a brand new trial out of Ohio for Matheau Moore. He's charged with 2 counts of felony murder and felonious assault in the death of his wife, Emily Noble. Noble was last seen on the night of her 52nd birthday in May of 2020. The defendant said they went to sleep in separate rooms, woke up to her being gone, her keys, wallet, phone, and car still at the residence. 4 months later, her remains would be discovered hanging from a tree by a USB cord. Moore was arrested 9 months later after Noble's body was found. Prosecutors believe he staged his wife's death as a suicide. On Monday afternoon session, we had a chance to interview Amanda Coleman, a producer of a program called The Vanish Podcast. The podcast Moore appeared on to talk about his wife's disappearance. Coleman described her interaction with Moore over the production of their episodes on the case. Let's take a listen.
He was missing for several months. I spoke to him, I believe, in June and again in August, but her remains were found in September. So I didn't notice any discernible difference in him except for one major thing, and that was that he started out the second interview by saying, well, you can't use any of this without my permission. And that stuck out as very strange to me because you reached out to us and you asked for our help in getting your wife's name and her story out there with the hopes of finding her. So then you want to control what we can and what we can't air. And that was really strange that by the second interview, he was trying to rein it in and say, well, you can't use this unless I give you permission. I don't know. I have not been to any of the searches. I only know what I have been told and what I have read online. But he did say, as you played the clip from him, he did say that he was not able to help. And I did ask him what he meant by that. And he just kept saying, I'm not able to help. They won't let me help. I don't know who the ambiguous they is, but it was insistent that he was not able to help. And his only assistance was directing me to share with our listeners where you could go and pick up flyers. And so that always sticks out as strange to me. When in my career as a criminologist, when I have a missing persons case and I have an entire set of people and they're all looking for the missing person and there's one who isn't, I have to believe that they're not looking for the missing person because they already know where they are.
Wow. All I can say is that I'm not a criminologist. I was a former homicide prosecutor and a criminal defense attorney now. I have seen many instances in which, especially spouses and people that are subject of interest, because that's where we go first, have refused to cooperate, refused to help an investigation, and in fact were not guilty of the offense, Bob. These are the kind of things, listen, hopefully it doesn't spill out into a courtroom, but we're getting into the motivations of people. I'm sure that this individual was told either by lawyers or other people not. I mean, it's the first thing out of my mouth with every client that gets on the phone who want to go in to protest their innocence. And I've seen people go in and do it, and detectives don't accept it or don't believe it and what have you. And yet I could think of at least 5 or 6 cases where they refused to cooperate at all, and all the detectives went to what that woman was saying, they must be the person that did it, and it turned out not to be right. I think we have to be very, very, very careful with this kind of Svengali interpretation of the way people react.
Well, and how often have we seen interviews of a defendant, and those interviews result in an admission of culpability. Here you don't have that, but you have an individual voluntarily asking to go on the airwaves and get some sort of a story out. He gave some concern to the interviewer in the process about how distant he was to the disappearance, when you would think it's somebody close. And of course, as you pointed out, whenever you have a disappearance of someone and then you find they're murdered or they're dead, you start looking first at the closest people to that individual. So, who is they, as you pointed out? Maybe he talked to a lawyer at some point and they said, you shouldn't be making any of these statements, or you better be able to control what's released here.
Yeah, and again, because of the possibility of misinterpretation, you don't want your client, even an innocent one, to speak unless you have a controlled environment, maybe immunity being granted or something where at least they're protected, that they can assist, but by the same token, nothing they say can be used against them as a technique. There's a couple of different techniques that can be found. An investigator could do it, a lawyer can advance arguments on behalf of the person, but there is nothing unusual with not cooperating. And you bring up something about give statements that inculpate themselves. We've had cases in which people have inculpated themselves and said they did something that later turns out to be wrong. They didn't do it. And I know it's counterintuitive as that may sound to the world. The fact of the matter is that is a reality. So we're dealing in the course of human nature and human psyche. And I mean, there are people that have falsely confessed and said, and I've had this happen with it, I just figured I must have done it because they're telling me I did it, and who else would have done it? It turns out it wasn't them.
Well, and there's a whole science about that too, as you know from these experts at these trials. A lot of that is the fight before the trial, because if those interviews and those admissions are really suspect, they don't come in at trial. The ones that come in a trial then have to sort of be attacked as, well, I really didn't mean that, I really didn't say that. Here you don't even have that. So it's going to be an interesting case because I haven't heard anything yet about there being anything to suggest a struggle or anything in the house. And because they lived close to each other, any linkage, physical evidence to him to her, not necessarily something that's going to be dispositive. So it's going to be interesting to see what they have to link him to her the day she died and when she died.
And I'm not saying that he's not the person who did it, but I hope what I'm going to hear during the course of the presentation of this evidence is that any good homicide prosecution still keeps on going and tries to eliminate every possible suspect so that the defense can't come back and say, you listen to that interview, you jump to conclusions, and you put square pegs in round holes, and it happens. Anyway, let's listen to more from Coleman's interview where she talked about the role the podcast played in the investigation.
I like to believe, and I think Marissa and I agree on this as the two of us that work on this podcast together. I like to believe that the resolution of crime is always the hard work of a team of people who make a huge dedicated effort to see that crime come to an end. And so we're kind of at the beginning. We've kind of are at the beginning of that process now. But I do think that the things that Matt told us were important, whether he's innocent or whether he's guilty. The things he told us were extremely important. And I hope that if a jury finds him guilty of murder, that the things that he told us played an important role in that, because I think some of the things that he said were